Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We're going to begin momentarily. Good evening, everyone. Bruchim habayim. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. It is an honor to share this evening with you. I am delighted on behalf of our YU Torah Mitzion Kolo to welcome all of you to a very special conversation this evening with an extraordinary woman, grandmother, and now author, Mrs. Pam Cohen, our special guest this evening, who is joining us with the recent release of her very special, beautiful new book called Hidden Heroes. It's published by Geffen, if you have not seen it yet. Available at brick and mortar and e-resources online, called Hidden Heroes, One Woman's Story of Resistance and Rescue in the Soviet Union by Pamela Braun Cohen. Mrs. Cohen is really an extraordinary individual and a member of our local Chicagoland Jewish community, and has been for quite some time. And this book, aside from being an incredible testament to her Ahavas Yisrael, her efforts, her heroic work on behalf of Soviet Jewry, has relevance to all of us, specifically right now, as we are in a very interesting period, that there are Jews across the world in the former Soviet Union who are affected by a crisis, and at the same time, now that this crisis has been going on for several months, are somewhat out of the news cycle. And so this is an evening for an opportunity for us to reconnect on a level of Ahavas Yisrael to Jews who are around the world, and to do so at a time that is important because it could be forgotten. And that's kind of the theme of this book, which is that for many of us, at least in my generation, this story needs to be told. And even for those who are from a slightly older generation than mine, it needs to be retold and not forgotten. And we need to keep these messages at the front of our attention throughout the course of our lives in our journey in Avodas Hashem. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us and to welcome Mrs. Cohen. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. Great to have you.
Thank you, Rabbi Brand. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be with you.
Awesome. So maybe tell us a little bit about how this book came to be, because it's the journey of your personal odyssey, but it's also the story of the, I guess you could call it, the emancipation of Russian Jewry, the Russian Jewry movement, the freedom of these Jews who were imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain, because this backstory will help a lot of people understand what's going on today in Russia and in the former Soviet Republic of Ukraine.
Right. I mean, the history of what is happening in Ukraine and in Russia is very evolutionary, and it's based on really the history that I would say began primarily in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, in which imposed and you really have to, it's so hard, Rabbi, today to imagine what the Soviet Union was like even 20, 30 years ago. I mean, today we have the internet and we have telephone calls, and there's nowhere that we can't reach. And 20, 30, 40 years ago, the Soviet Union was pretty much like what we see North Korea today, impenetrable in terms of borders, both going in and going out. And it was, we weren't able to have any contact with people inside the Soviet Union. The KGB, which employed millions of people, were directed by the Kremlin to suppress all dissent, to deny the right to speech, to deny the right to assemble, to deny freedom of religion. to deny really freedom of thought, to impose social conformity on a cowed population. And people lived in under a reign of terror. It was a fear, afraid to be individual, afraid to speak out, afraid to assert any kind of identity other than Soviet identity. And that is the background in which we thought at the time 3 to 5 million Jews were living, from Vladivostok, which was by Japan, all the way to the European borders, past the Baltic nations. In that climate of fear, there had been absolute, I would say, cultural and religious Judenrein. Judaism was like Judenrein in the Soviet Union. There was persecuted to the extent since 1917 that there was no traces of anything Jewish. Older people might be able to remember an Altazadi, but there was no Hebrew. There were no free synagogues. The only synagogue in Moscow was controlled by KGB. The rabbi was a KGB appointed rabbi. There were no books. There was no Hebrew. There were no teachers. There was no consciousness of Judaism. There was no contact with Jews in the West. There was no contact with Israel. There was no understanding of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. And this is what the environment in which maybe 5 million people were living across a huge landmass over like 11 time zones. And in addition, if that wasn't enough to paralyze life, freedom of the individual, there was also state-imposed anti-Semitism. Now, today we are reading about what I would call social anti-Semitism, what we're seeing in the university. But as of now, thank God, we are not seeing in America anti-Semitism that is coming from the government directly to the people. And in the Soviet Union from 1917 on, there was Kremlin-sponsored anti-Semitic campaign, which unfortunately, like today, was based on anti-Zionism. And so Jews, up until 1967, had very little consciousness of their identity, and what they had was very negative. I like to say that they had absorbed the exterior anti-Semitism, and it developed in them in a kind of deformed way of looking at who they were. That pretty much what happened. What was the catalyst that made the change was 1967. That was the major influence. State TV, Kremlin TV, portrayed the Israeli army defecting, attacked by, all the surrounding nations and throwing up their hands in defeat. However, Jews know how to read between the lines, and Soviet Jews perceive for the first time, Rabbi, idea that there was a Jewish homeland, that was worth so much that Jews were willing to defend it with their lives. And Jews, not by the thousands, but especially in Riga and Leningrad, Jews developed a kind of dignity, a self-dignity, a kind of Jewish pride. They walked out of their homes a few inches taller, even with the anti-Semitism that was coming from the state TV about the war. And they decided that they would apply to immigrate. That was like a lightning bolt. And but there was no process for immigration. The process was conceived in order to deter immigration. Although it was in the Soviet Constitution, they weren't allowed to immigrate. The borders were sealed. And so whoever applied were refused permission, and those people were called refuseniks. Now, a few of those people, as I said, especially in Latvia, in Riga, found older people who had served even during World War II, who remembered a little bit of Yiddish and a little bit of Hebrew. And they learned word by word. And I'm talking about very few, maybe 5, 10 people. And they learned underground how to speak Hebrew word by word.
Now, the kinds of people that you're talking about, you have personal relationships with many of these people, whether it's Yosef Mendelevich or Natan Sharansky. These people are people who you knew. Now, how does this fit into our understanding of what's going on in Russia today? Because then we could skip ahead just for a moment. So you step up. We're going to come back to that in a little bit of your involvement. So now the Soviet Union crumbles. What happens to the Jews after the Soviet Union falls apart? Skipping ahead.
Well, it's Rabbi, it's a really big skip because
I want to come back to it in a minute. I just want to kind of give people this.
What happened in the long run with these few people that were teaching Hebrew underground, although many of them, as I'll tell you in a few minutes, happened, defied the KGB, defied the Kremlin, and started teaching Hebrew and developing underground Tarbut, Jewish culture, and started to understand who they were as Jews. And that spread, diffused like tentacles throughout the Soviet Union until the end of the Soviet Union in the year like over, 1991, until the crumbling, which has much to do with what happened in the process of the immigration movement. And by then, Jews who wanted to stay, and there were many that you couldn't leave their parents or who had felt responsible. And I have friends who are still in Lviv today, Lviv in Ukraine, who felt that they could not leave people who were Holocaust survivors and who could not travel, and who built soup kitchens and started to build like education facilities like Yad Yisrael. They built, especially if you're looking at Ukraine, there were over like 200 major centers of Jewish education in the in Ukraine today, and that after the attack of the Russians, that has started to disintegrate. So it was a period that I've witnessed of building a Jewish identity first, enough to spawn an immigration movement. And then in terms of what the remaining populations, both in Russia, interesting enough, and in Ukraine, a regeneration of Jewish cultural life and religious life, which is now disintegrating.
So this is something that we need to be sensitive to and to realize what it meant to rebuild these Jewish communities and these institutions and how significant it is that they are in peril. So now that's giving us kind of like the bird's eye view of the beginning of the story and where we are today. But let's get really to your incredible role and the fact that you were just inspired as an individual. You were not a trained political activist, although there are some amazing photographs in this book with you and some very significant political operatives, we could say. But you just decided you cared about Am Yisrael and you were going to do something about it. So share with us a little bit about some of the things that you did that really helped move this movement forward.
Okay, so I just want to go back a little bit for your listeners to understand that after 1967, when Jews started to apply to immigrate and very small numbers were refused permission, there was a very incredible group of young people from mostly Leningrad and Riga who decided, after being refused permission for 3 years, that they had to do the impossible, that they were going to take on something that they knew that was going to end up either in prison sentences or the death penalty. They had to do something so dramatic as to send up a flare to Americans and to the American government and to Israelis and to Jews throughout the world, that there were millions of Jews in the Soviet Union that were in a state where they could not live as Jews, but they could not leave. They were in like a kind of massive concentration camp. And they decided that they would do the impossible. They would try to hijack a plane, take a plane from Leningrad to Sweden, apprehend the pilot. There was a pilot among them, and they were going to leave the plane, leave the pilot on the tarmac, certainly not do anything to him, and then go to Israel. And of course, they were all arrested on the tarmac and sentenced to long prison sentences. When I was a young mom, I had little kids and terrified to, I had you're right, no background. But when I heard that Jews were being arrested in the Soviet Union, I was born during the Holocaust. And when I was a young person, maybe like in the 18, 19 years old, when the information really about the Holocaust began to become public, I could not understand how American Jews allowed 1 million Jewish children to go up the smokestacks. It was somehow conceivable what happened in Europe, the Nazis, but American Jews, to me, they were complicit by their silence. And when I heard that Jews were being arrested, I understood from the very beginning that Jews are not hijackers, that there was another story. And something in me yelled inside viscerally, not on my watch. This was not going to happen. And it took me a while. It took me months to be able to get information. There was no information. I didn't get information from the establishment organizations or from the synagogues. But finally, I found information that told me who these people were and what they were doing. And I began to create an activist network. In a very short time, I found that there was an activist network that existed in Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry, that existed in Highland Park. And I got what I would call an equivalent of a PhD in Soviet studies from its chairman and Soviet-US relations, and shortly became the chairman of Chicago Action, and 10 years later became the national president of an organization that was also made of grassroots groups, councils throughout the country. There were 43 of them. What we did was a complicated, very professional response. I mean, when I have told refuseniks, as they understood what we did, they couldn't believe that we were volunteers, because not paid, not professionals. The first job was to gather information and documentation and oral testimonies and create absolutely perfect lists of refuseniks that we could present to the State Department, so that the State Department could present them to the Soviets at every time there was a bilateral meeting between America and the Soviets. So the first step was the documentation, and how we did that was a whole story. We sent emissaries, we sent shlichim. And if we would have sent you, Rabbi Brand, you would have submitted to 18 hours of briefings, and you would have learned Cyrillic, and you would have known every case and the address of what they were. There would be nothing on you when you went into the Soviet Union, and to bring back the information that we needed about them, and to bring them information about what we were doing on their behalf. In order to make this a primary function of U.S.-Soviet relations, we had to also attract the press, because the newspapers and the media, would demonstrate to the government that this was an American ideal, the idea of free immigration, Jewish immigration. And so we did a lot of press conferences and obviously demonstrations and all the things that most people know about with Soviet Jewry. But the big thing that we did was to create adoptions. We had synagogues and institutions throughout the country that would adopt a refusenik. We would give them the case, and we would bring them up to date on any movement on the case. And those adoptions, those synagogues, those institutions were responsible of getting that information to their congressman in Washington. And so when we brought the cases to the congressman in Washington, they really had no option, because their constituents were pressing them on Jewish immigration. So they were getting it from their constituents, and they were getting it from us. And we linked immigration to trade. In 1974, we said we had the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which said You can't have the favored nation status without Jewish immigration. I met with congressmen and State Department, and as you said, secretaries of state and presidents to brief them about the state of Jewish immigration and to convince them, which we did, that Jewish immigration was a function of US-Soviet relations.
It's really extraordinary. Obviously, it's incredible what you did. And in addition to all of the institutional side that you're describing, there was also a human side and relationships that you had with people. Maybe share with everyone who's watching a little bit about somebody maybe who introduced themselves to you, who you thought you wouldn't recognize them, but you did. You know, the personal connections that you forged with these incredible refuseniks.
Okay. Now, there's just one other point that I want to bring out in introducing the subject, and that is I want your listeners to understand that we understood that this was a mitzvah, that this ransoming of the captives was a mitzvah that we were doing. But we did not consider ourselves do-gooders or paternalizing or patronizing poor Soviet Jews. We saw it as they were really standing up for themselves. And I just wanted to take a little bit of detour for people to understand what it was like to apply for an immigration permit. That they had to take a piece of paper. First of all, they needed an invitation from the anti-Soviet state of Israel, which was officially anti-Soviet. And they had to have this piece of paper from this heinous country, and they had to apply, and then they had to get an application. And many of these people were scientists working at scientific institutions, and you had to take your paper to your institution head, and you had to get it signed, which you were immediately fired. But even worse, they called meetings of your colleagues in which you were publicly humiliated. All your degrees were taken from you. You walked out as having nothing, gained nothing in your professional life. You had to take it to your apartment, and you had to have the manager of the apartment sign it, in which you were a social pariah. You had your children had to take it to their schools. By the end of the process, you had no jobs, no dignity. You didn't know who you were. You were no longer a Soviet man. And you began to say, if I'm no longer Soviet homietikus, no longer Soviet man, who am I? And they began a search for their Jewish identity. We in the West were very much like the people that I was working with. There were many of us who were very much like those Soviet Jews. We also we may have had strong identity, but we did not grow up with the religious background. And as we developed a partnership, and my goal was to develop a partnership with Soviet Jews, that they would be deliberating and determining their own future, and we were simply their voices in their West that would act on their behalf according to the policies and principles that they themselves espoused. So they had a huge effect on me, because here I was at the time living in Deerfield, Illinois, with my kids. As I said, very identified Jews working on behalf of Soviet Jewry. And I went, Lenny and I went, my husband and I went first trip in 1978 to the Soviet Union. And we met a man who was an underground Hebrew teacher, which means that he was teaching Hebrew, even though it was not official. And he could have been arrested and was arrested, for teaching Hebrew. And when I met him, it was a long story, which you have to read about in the book, because we thought that we were followed, because his wife thought we were followed, but we made it to the apartment. And we had actually been in contact with him before we met him. Of course, he did not know we were coming. And he said, Pamela, you're Pamela. It was like when we met people in the Soviet Union, it was like a reunion of people that you were in your family. It was not just meeting a strange Jew. It was people that you had developed a relationship with, even though you had never met them before. So the first Friday night that I had in his home, and I don't always tell the story, but it is in the book. It was the first Friday night, Shabbos night, that my husband and I experienced. And Mila Volvovsky lit candles, and I lit candles. And I had a vision then, which I keep with me every Shabbos as I light. I saw in Moscow what the world must look like from Hashem's perspective in Shemayim. When the lights go on first, the lights are kindled first in Yerushalayim, and then Tel Aviv, and then Athens, and then Rome, and then Paris, and then Spain, and then New York, and how the world is illuminated by the lights of Jewish women. And it was a staggering experience for me. All the steps that the Volvovskys took, he was a brilliant scientist, a cyberneticist, and who was fired from his job as early as 1978 when we first met him, and began a process of, like all the other refuseniks, building Jewish identity and having the moral courage to assert their Jewish identity in a country which was not only socially anti-Semitic, but governmentally anti-Semitic, becoming observant. And when he had been exiled before his arrest to Gorky, and asked me a book on kashrutz, and I said to my husband, if Aryeh Volvovsky is keeping kosher in Gorky, it's a Zachen Vey. I don't even know what a Zachen Vey meant. My mother used to use it. It's a Zachen Vey if we're not going to keep kosher in Deerfield. It had a direct, everything, the challenge, the steps that Soviet Jews, my people in Russia, were taking to assert their Jewish identity and their Yiddishkeit in a place where it could end up in prison camp was life-changing for us. I have one more story that is so striking. A refusnik, Alexander Beryasin, wrote me a story. Actually, he didn't write it to me. He wrote it to one of the adopters of the synagogue that we had assigned to him. And I'll never forget the letter. He's told about a transport of Jews from Europe to Auschwitz, who learned that somebody told them in the boxcar that it was Simchas Torah. And the Jews in the boxcar said, the cattle car said, Rabbi. We said, but there was a rabbi in the boxcar. We have no Torah. We have no Sefer Torah. And the rabbi said, pick up a Jewish child. And that is our Sefer Torah. And Rabbi, when I heard the story, I thought, I'm living in Deerfield. Most people and Jews in Deerfield don't celebrate Simchas Torah. Look what our people went through to celebrate Simchas Torah. And it was these stories, these experiences imprinted themselves deeply on my husband and I and my family.
So this had a big impact on you and your family, but what you did also had an amazing impact on them. When you did this book launch in Israel, you had so many amazing people who were there with you. Maybe someone by the name of Chaim Berstein. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, you know about that. So Chaim Berstein was a Leningrad refusnik who was about 18 years old when I used to call him every week. And over the years, he became...
So just pause for 1 second. Just explain to everybody what that means, you called them every week. First of all, okay. I don't think you had a cell phone with free minutes to Russia, right?
Rabbi,
and then
Rabbi, that is You couldn't call Jews in the Soviet Union. If you called them on their home phone number, the Soviets had a web of KGB sensors that monitored every phone call and every letter. And I'm not exaggerating, by every letter and every phone call. And they would block the phone call. So sometimes if I did call a phone number, I would hear like a train in the phone. They would block it, with sound. And in the worst cases, they would just simply block the telephone number of the refuseniks family, which was a very big inconvenience for them, not to be able to call people in their own city. So we developed messenger calls, which was a complicated way of having a refusnik contacted to come to a public telephone call. And it was, in order to do it, the Soviet operators were very, very hostile to us. They knew what we were doing. And we had to brief the American operators in order to have them stand up to the Soviet operators to put through the call, which is, it's all in the book.
Yes.
But I used to telephone call every week. Soviet Jews really, the refusnik needed those phone calls, as long as they believed that as long as we knew about them, as long as we kept a public light on them, as long as we kept them in our vision, they were protected. And one of the means of protection was to make phone calls and to send tourists to them, our shlichim, our emissaries. So I used to make a messenger call to Chaim for, I don't know, a very long time. And he had been arrested. He was arrested many times on short sentences, 14-day sentences for quote unquote misdemeanors. You have to understand that these people were not only persecuted, they were followed, they were surveyed 24 hours a day. Anybody who was a refusnik put themselves in the limelight in the Soviet Union, and they became enemies of the state without even being tried. And it took a tremendous amount of moral courage to stand up to them and to assert their identity and their Jewishness in a way that was just extremely powerful for me in the West. And I hadn't heard from or seen Chaim since he was, I don't know, it's maybe something like 30 years. And I was presenting at the book at the book launch, and all of a sudden this man comes up who was like a grown man. I don't know, he almost looked middle-aged to me, but I no longer can tell age. And he was a black jacket and a black kippah, and he came up right up to where I was sitting, and he said, "Pamela," and that's what my bubby named me, and that's what refuseniks called me. And he said, "Pamela, you may not remember me." But the minute he said that, I knew his voice. I could not place who he was, but I knew that voice, and it was Chaim Berstein. He had come to the book launch. It was really, the book launch was, we had like 5 former prisoners of conscience that were there, including Sharansky. It was kind of a love-in. It was a highlight.
That is,
they had wanted
extraordinary. I mean, those people, and the fact that you still maintain that connection and the impact that you had on someone who would recognize and reach out and want to connect with you 30 years later, that's just a testament to the impact that you had. So I guess the question becomes now for us, for those of us who are watching, so what do we take from this story? What is our call to action, so to speak, in an era where, thank God, we don't face the same kind of struggles that those Russian Jews. So what are the lessons that we need to learn from this story?
Okay. So it would be derelict if I didn't say this, Rabbi. What I realized, what I learned from the story in the process, and I spent my entire adult life working on behalf of Soviet Jews, really, until my grandchildren were born. And what I realized, that there are no accidents. I realized, I would say retrospectively, after I had been working in doing this for a number of years, I was so ill prepared for this. I had no background, and I was really very shy, and I didn't want to be in the public eye, and I didn't want to be center stage. But I really see that how I saw clearly, and I still see how Kodesh Baruch Hu really sent me on a path that was almost, it was tailor-made for me. And that every single thing that happened that I needed, every person that I needed, every resource that I was like miraculously provided. And I'm going to come back to your question, but I think this is really fundamental for me to convey, is that to the extent that we had a prisoner who was beaten very badly in prison camp, and the Soviets didn't want a body in the prison camp. It would be very bad public relations to have a Jew in the middle of Soviet Israeli American Soviet American relations, to have a refusenik who would be bitten to death in prison. So they literally released him, and he was in terrible condition. He was able to make it to Moscow, and I got a telephone call from the refusenik leadership in Moscow saying that there was a Chinese practitioner who could take care of him, because they couldn't be treated in hospitals because they were refuseniks. You didn't have access to the same, benefits that a Soviet citizen had. So they needed bear fat. I live in Chicago. I live in Highland Park at the time, Deerfield at the time. Where was I going to get bear fat? But we did have some activists in Anchorage, and I picked up the phone. And remarkably, when I picked up the phone, I said, "Do you have bear fat?" "Of course we have bear fat." But what was more remarkable was that he said, and this was the time when there was no travel to the Soviet Union, no tourist travel, very little, because it was so dangerous for Americans to go. There was one businessman that was leaving the next day. He said, "I've got a businessman leaving from Anchorage to Vladivostok, and I know that I can get it to Moscow within 11 time zones away within 24 hours. And I'm telling you, 48 hours after they asked for the bear fat, it was delivered in Moscow. And of course, refusing thought I could do anything, but it was really HaKadosh Baruch Hu who was providing everything that we needed. I think the takeaway from all of this is that, first of all, the big takeaway for me, and I realized this as I was completing the final stages of the book, was that just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu exiled us for our baseless hatred, the baseless love that I witnessed between Jews, just plain ordinary Jews in America and Israel, for Jews in the Soviet Union, was so absolutely compelling and so strong and so determined that I really believe that baseless love triggered a heavenly cosmic force that opened the gates to the Soviet Union, creating the largest rescue of Jews in Jewish history, and in its wake brought down the Kremlin. I think that the big takeaway is what we can do when we feel that we are united with our brothers and sisters. We may not agree with them. We may have different points of view. We may be in different places. Look, I mean, during the years that we were advocating on behalf of Soviet Jews, when I became the national president of the Union of Councils of Soviet Jews, we had Jews who became observant. We had Jews that wanted to go to Israel. We had Jews that wanted to come to America. We had Jews that believed in Jewish culture. We believed, but we fought for them all. They all had the right to leave the country. We believed that we had to take them out one Jewish neshama at a time. We never could have expected the kind of miraculous rescue that happened. But we can release a kind of a miraculous effect if we feel really connected and feel each other and respect each other and love each other. That's to me one of the biggest lessons. And to defend each other. And when we shouldn't be pointing fingers at different sections of our population. We're all Yidden, we're all Jews, we're all one. We all belong to each other. We're responsible for each other. I think the second thing is that each one of us plays a role, each one of us. And each one of us, regardless of our limitations, and God knows I had them, each one of us has a role to play and can make a major difference in life, in our Jewish history, with other people, and that we shouldn't discount ourselves from that process.
I think those are two incredibly meaningful and important lessons that each one of us, number one, the idea that we need to reinforce our connection to Am Yisrael as a whole, to continue to come back to that, but also to realize the significance of each one of us, that if a young mom from Deerfield can stand up and become a leader in a worldwide movement, which ultimately, like you said, the Ribbono Shel Olam rolled out to ultimately topple the Soviet Union through breaking down this society of fear. I think each one of us can make a difference, and whether that's finding a volunteer opportunity that's local or reaching out to something that's national or even international, each one of us has an opportunity. So I think both of those messages are things that we can incorporate to our life. Is there any closing story or thought that you want to share with our special guests who are watching and joining us this evening?
Oh my goodness. I think I've shared like the most heart-wrenching stories. I just want to reiterate that nothing in life is happenstance. I hear so many people say, "Oh, I was lucky," or "I was," or "it happened." I think that in my situation, where I had somebody, for example, who we needed a heart valve to get to Riga because somebody would be treated at a hospital. They needed a valve, but they wouldn't give them the valve. And literally, where was I going to get a heart valve in a very short time? I happened to have had a tourist that was leaving that we could send. But immediately, like the minute I hung up the phone from somebody saying we need a heart valve, my partner, Marilyn Tallman in Chicago, walked in and said, "You know what? I just got a telephone call from Dr. So-and-so. He said, if you ever need a heart valve, you can call me." And we had a heart valve in Riga. I mean, I think that there is no the stories, the people that I met, the heroicism. I mean, one of the things that the last thought I would want to leave you with, I think, is that I heard a story from someone that we were just in Israel, and somebody told me that they were checking into a hotel in Zikron Yaakov, and in front of them, Natan Sharansky and Avital were checking into the hotel. And the people that we knew, our friends, got, when it was their turn, this was in Israel. They said to the concierge, "Do you know who you just checked in?" And the young woman said, "No." And my friend said, "That was Natan Sharansky. He's one of the heroes of our time." One of the things that I'm so happy to be on this Zoom and this YouTube call is because today our young people don't know that we have heroes. They don't know that there are great people for us to look up to and to admire. They don't know the names of Yosef Mendelevich. They don't know the names of these people. And it's the reason that I call the book Hidden Heroes. we do have people that have stood up to the negative, the terrible periods of our history. And we have to know who they are. We have to be not blind to history. We have to follow in the history and follow in learning and understanding who we are and what our purpose is and what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from us and also the people who have made a difference, those hidden heroes.
So I would say there are two groups of hidden heroes that we have the opportunity to learn about in this book. The one group that you're referring to now are those incredible refuseniks who sacrifice so much for their neshama, for their inner destiny as Jews, but also the hidden heroes, the Mrs. Cohens and all the other individuals who were here in the United States who were sending, like, I wouldn't have thought that somebody would need a heart valve. Like, you were taking care of every possible need and issue that could arise. That is really the tremendous heroism and Ahavas Yisrael, love for Jews. That's such an incredible inspiration for all of us. So both the refuseniks and all of those who stood up to the Soviet Empire on behalf of the Ribbono Shalom and for the world to see are documented so beautifully in this volume, Hidden Heroes, One Woman's Story of Resistance and Rescue in the Soviet Union. And that is our special guest tonight, who we bless and wish the Ribbono Shalom should continue to give you good health and nachas from all of your children and to continue to inspire so many. If you have a chance to get this book, this is your opportunity. We thank you all for joining us, and we thank you so much, Mrs. Cohen,
Thank you,
for
Rabbi
the inspiration this
Thank
evening.
you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.